Welcome to this digital Clingendael State of the Union 2020, a Europe à la carte menu of 8 webinars in 4 days. This is a very timely conference on top of the EU-US elections, which determine the state of the other union, the United States of America. Although in European seminars, the talk of the town is about European sovereignty and strategic autonomy, we'd better stick to the diagnosis that the state of the EU and the state of the USA are very interdependent, economically, politically, militarily. That's why these elections in the US matter so much to us, and that's why the state of the EU itself is so important as well. The annual State of the Union speech of the President of the European Commission in September is always about future aspirations and horizons, and rightly so, from the EU perspective. It's important, however, that member states also discuss the State of the Union from their specific perspectives, so that we can arrive at shared views on problems and solutions. Clingendael has therefore started immediately after Barroso's first State of the Union speech with a public debate. The objective of our State of the Union is diagnosis. What is the State of the Union? And ideas for EU governance and leadership. So diagnosis first. We chose for the conference title, Europe Caught Up in Polycrisis. This term, polycrisis, was coined by former European Commission President Juncker to refer to the confluence of multiple mutually reinforcing challenges facing the EU, with rifts that have opened up not only between member states, but also within domestic political systems. And that was still before COVID-19. In webinars on the Euro, migration and COVID-19, we will do a horizon scan of what to expect, what are the simmering next crises, and assess if the EU is prepared for that. Second, all webinars will generate ideas how to tackle the polycrisis. In the face of crisis, the Union's institutions and governance have evolved significantly. The Recovery Fund grand bargain was possible, and another potential grand bargain, the Migration Pact, is at the negotiation table. So how to overcome diversity among member states and strengthen the EU's capacity to act. And third, ideas on leadership. The all-time low in transatlantic relations and lack of trust in the American leadership are part of Europe's polycrisis, but they also make it more difficult to solve global problems. Therefore, there's an urgent need for European leadership. Like I already mentioned, in all sessions, we will combine these European discussions with a Dutch perspective. We are therefore very grateful that Minister of Foreign Affairs, Stef Blok, will open this conference, and the Dutch Sherpa in the EU, Michael Stibbe, will conclude this conference. And we are glad we can do this via Zoom to enable placing our national discussions in the heart of the European debates. Former President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, has said Europe has too many Cassandras, politicians and intellectuals who warned of impending doom but were equally helpless to prevent it. And too few Odysseuses, smart, efficient leaders, ruthless where necessary, capable of sacrifices and practical to the extreme. So let's take this as our motto for the conference and strive to be resourceful and practical. Now, Minister Blok, we know how much you value being a European and how you, as a young student, traveled to Paris to study the French culture and language. That was the start of your personal odyssey through Europe. And we're very much looking forward to hearing from you how you see the European odyssey develop. Minister Blok, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Monika, for your kind introduction. And it's good to see so many experts and interested parties here with us digitally today. I'd like to open with a quote attributed to Charles Darwin. It is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. And I bring it up here today because I believe You can easily replace species with governments or societies. It is a quote that reflects the world we live in today. A world that feels different, scary even. I'm thinking, of course, of the latest tragedy, the knife attack in Nice, in which 3 innocent people were killed. But also of the geopolitical winds that have been blowing fiercely the last couple of years. And now we're in the eye of the global storm that is COVID-19. To a greater or lesser degree, every country in the world is grappling with this crisis. Many people have lost their lives. Many more are dealing with this tragedy on a personal level. Countries around the world are struggling with the devastating impact the pandemic is having on their economies. For tulip growers in the Netherlands, for instance, Friday the 13th of March this year was a true horror show. When tulip stems came up at the world's largest flower auction in Aalsmeer, the price was stalled over and over again at zero. Frank Uitenboogaard, who runs a 110-year-old family farm in Noordwijkerhout, made a tough decision to destroy his tulip stems, all 200,000 of them. That hurt a lot, he would later tell the New York Times in a telephone interview, adding, "It's very painful, because you start in July with digging the bulbs, and you have to give them the right treatment to plant them in October, and later move them to the greenhouse. We had very good quality tulips this year," he went on. Finally, he said that he took his bike and went cycling while the tulip stems were destroyed, because he simply couldn't bear to watch. And I'm sure he wasn't the only grower who felt devastated. According to the estimates by the largest cooperative for flower and plant growers in the Netherlands, about 400 million flowers were destroyed that month, including 140 million tulip stems. Now, I don't know why this particular example stuck with me, but I think it might have something to do with the fact that I once had a summer job peeling tulip bulbs, as so many Dutch school boys and girls had in the 70s. And as was the custom in those days, I would spend the money I earned on LPs and cassette tapes. The youth now don't even know what that stands for. So I guess you could say that is why I personally lost my heart to the fields where the tulips grow. But this is, of course, just one example from one sector that illustrates the economic loss and tragedy that have resulted from this pandemic. Who could have imagined a year ago, for instance, that The Economist would run an article that opened with the words, "Planet Earth is shutting down. Factories stop production. People saw schools, restaurants, bars, museums, sports facilities closed. Countries shut their borders and consumers stopped spending. Hundreds of millions of people around the world isolated themselves from others. And many are still in isolation as we speak." So yes, COVID-19 is the toughest challenge I've ever known our government to face. I expect it's the same for many governments around the world. And of course, for the European Union as a whole. It's still fresh in our minds how the first wave of the pandemic sent EU member states into lockdown. We closed our borders. Here in the Netherlands, we could not even travel to neighboring Belgium. It was a shock. Obviously, many people have come to take traveling freely within the EU for granted. And on top of those limitations, we found ourselves vulnerable to other geopolitical players. But after the initial shock, thoughts turned to handling the fallout. EU member states recognized that COVID-19 placed unprecedented pressure on our continent. Pressure that we were able to handle better by working together. The European Union enabled us to cooperate politically as well as practically. And such cooperation will continue to be needed in the EU. In fact, I firmly believe that we need, now more than ever, a strong European Union. Not only because history has already taught us the simple lesson that we are stronger when we stand together, but also because we are more powerful when we join forces, and more prosperous when we do business together, more secure when we look out for each other. In other words, A strong European Union is essential if we are to pull through the polycrisis we are facing. Whether we are dealing with China's expanding global reach, with Russia's aggressiveness, with the arc of instability around Europe, or more specifically with the situation in Belarus, with illiberal democracies, with the challenges to the rules-based international order, transformation of economic and social models, rapid technological change, changing demographic patterns, the refugee crisis, or last but certainly not least, the effects of climate change. Now, the European Union can only be strong if its member states are strong. And this is sometimes overlooked by the professionals working in or with the European institutions. Strong member states with competitive economies and with strong, independent institutions are essential for fostering stronger European cooperation and for upholding public support. And yes, that requires effort. Member states are not as strong as they could be. So what can be done about it? Most importantly, we must all, that includes the Netherlands, make sure our own house is in order. Policy advice is only effective if member states implement it. EU funding gives better results if member states spend it well. And coordination works when member states do what they promise. And perhaps this all sounds very abstract. Let me give therefore 3 examples relating to 3 aspects of the polycrisis: the economy, geopolitics, and the rule of law. First of all, the economy. We need to invest in our economic resilience so that we can continue to sell our products at competitive prices and generate profit. Over the last decade, China's GDP has grown on average by 7.8% per year. In the US, that figure is 2.3%, while Europe's GDP has grown by only 1.6% per year. We are still an economic powerhouse, but we need to step up our game in the decades ahead if we want to continue to wield economic power. And with that, geopolitical power. We need faster growth. The single market is based on setting standards, and we've been very successful at exporting them. It's widely known that American car manufacturers follow our standards, even for domestic products. And European data protection rules are applied by IT companies across the globe. This is, of course, no guarantee for the future. But if we move fast in future growth markets, like the digital and green transitions, we can still wield our regulatory power, spur innovation, and ensure a level playing field. At the same time, we're not naive. We have pushed the Commission to ensure that companies, state-owned or otherwise, that want to exploit our economic freedoms through unfair competition will be scrutinized and, where necessary, blocked from entering our markets. That's also why it's of the utmost importance that our economies converge, raising our competitiveness. Because if there are economic differences in the Eurozone, we risk the failure of our currency, the euro. And that's exactly why we once promised each other Eurozone convergence. But we have to admit that economic imbalances in the Eurozone seem hard to correct. Despite our agreement, member states are diverging, and differences between countries persist. This, of course, presents a challenge for the European Central Bank. After all, if a country's growth is structurally above the Eurozone average, the ECB's interest rate will be too low, and it will be unable to prevent that country's economy from overheating. And the result? Ever-rising capital flows to the country, higher wages and prices, and a worsening competitiveness. And if, on the other hand, a country's growth is significantly below average, an excessively high base rate will delay its economic recovery or even jeopardize it altogether. So I can only conclude that with current architecture, our Eurozone is a web of glass, superficially stable, but fragile when subjected to shocks. So we need structural reforms across the Eurozone. The Reform and Resilience Facility, agreed in July, provides a unique opportunity to get this reform right, because this facility, for the first time, offers large sums for growth-enhancing investment, while being closely linked to structural reforms. The investments can partly offset the pain of the reforms and get our economies on the right track for convergences, and make our economies fit for the 21st century by focusing on the green and digital transitions. We also have to strengthen our economy by implementing the Capital Markets Union. European capital markets continue to be fragmented, resulting in high lending costs for our companies. If we break down these barriers, it will be easier for our small, medium-sized enterprises to finance innovation and expansion. Then a second important solution I want to mention when it comes to creating a stronger and more united EU in a geopolitically turbulent world is politics, and more specifically, geopolitics. We need to talk not only the language of business and trade, but also the language of power, if we want to be able to step up when necessary. We're all aware, and President Trump has made it abundantly clear, that the US will not always come to our assistance. We cannot assume that our geopolitical interests will be protected by others. And that's also why we need to equip ourselves better to compete with China's influence on the world stage. China historically had a lower level of economic output than either the EU27 or the United States. But the situation has changed with the rapid transformation and continued expansion of the Chinese economy. As early as 2013, China's GDP in purchasing power parities exceeded that recorded for the EU27 for the first time. And by 2016, China had drawn level with the United States. In 2017, its GDP even surpassed that of the United States, a situation that China has since maintained. And that's why, as EU member states, we must stand together as one if we don't want to lose out in a geo-economy. We have our strengths, most notably the economic weight we pull, but we need to translate our economic weight into political influence, just like we need to continue to work on our strategic autonomy in order to increase our resilience and be strong enough to resist unwarranted foreign influence without giving into protectionism. But we also need to invest in a stronger and more effective European foreign policy. For instance, by adopting the EU global human rights sanction regime as soon as possible, so that we can speed up our decision-making on sanctions. Just look how long it took EU member states to reach consensus on imposing sanctions on Belarus. What if we could be quicker on our feet and decide on sanctions with a qualified majority? That would allow the EU to impose sanctions on human rights violators anywhere in the world. We could deny them access not only to EU territory, but also to financial assets in the EU. This would prevent them from doing business here. Above all, they would be outed before the eyes of the world as violators of human rights. And that's not a label anyone wants. In short, this new EU sanctions regime would show the world that the EU has teeth, and human rights abusers would feel our bite. That's how we are set apart from other geopolitical actors. That's how we talk the language of power. Finally, I come to the third aspect of the polycrisis we face, the rule of law, or as some call it, the guarantee of guarantees. Because the rule of law serves as a safeguard that enables our democracies to function properly. It ensures that individuals and businesses can invoke their rights before independent courts. And it affects judicial cooperation, the Schengen area, the single market, our police forces, and the daily lives of our citizens. You may be interested to know that the 2019 Global Competitiveness Index, which ranked the Netherlands as the most competitive country in Europe and the fourth worldwide, cited our high score on judicial independence as a crucial factor. This shows that respect for the rule of law as tangible economic benefits. Despite this, we're still not having frank and open dialogue among member states about rule of law. Even though mutual trust between member states is essential for an effectively functioning EU in which fundamental freedoms are guaranteed. This requires continuous investment in the European community of values by putting the proper functioning of the rule of law center stage, by strengthening the transparent governance of the EU, and by complying strictly with the agreements made. To sum up, I'm in favor of a strong European Union with strong EU member states. And I believe we can accomplish this by investing in a strong European economy and in the resilience of the member states. Because our prosperity, but also our geopolitical clout, is founded on our internal markets. I also believe that we have not yet achieved our full potential as the balancing power we could be. So we need to strengthen our resilience against the actions of other geopolitical powers and reduce our strategic dependencies in order to be a player, not a playing field. Finally, I emphasize the importance of the rule of law for the simple reason that it guarantees our freedom. Now, I imagine you have some questions. For example, how do we ensure member states to take ownership and responsibility? What can we do to make sure that other geopolitical powers don't play us off against each other? How do we ensure that member states trust each other? How do we emerge stronger from this polycrisis? These would be important questions, obviously. But this is where I would like to appeal to you, to academia, to Clingendael, to policymakers. We need you to exchange your views and discuss with your history, knowledge, your wisdom in this open forum, the necessary reforms, the options, the outcomes, and help us tackle the structural challenges to foster convergence and come up with ideas to strengthen member states so that together we can form a stronger European Union. That might feel like a stretch or beyond reach, but then I think of my grandmother, who once considered flying impossible, and yet in her lifetime had the possibility to take an airplane to go on holiday or visit a family overseas. Times changes fast, and the only constant is change. So it is up to us to be adaptable, to be more responsive to change. And if we can be responsive to change, we must be able to shape and alter trends and ultimately remake the future, our future. So let's not squander this opportunity, but grasp it with both hands. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Blok, for sharing your quite personal and enlightening perspective, which emphasizes the balance in the European Union. Yes, we are proceeding in deepening integration, but how can we balance that with the role, the resilience, and the strength of the member states? And you have touched upon three important domains, geopolitics, economics, and the rule of law. So allow me to start with some questions with the first, and I'm sure that my colleague Adriaan Schout will come in on the economic domain. And Adriaan will also harvest questions from the Q&A. Let me encourage all participants to type questions in that function in the Zoom platform. Adriaan can then connect you to the minister. Now, Mr. Blok, on geopolitics, we have both worked intensely on the new Dutch-China strategy last year in our respective functions. And one of your conclusions in the Dutch-China note was, without Europe, we're not going to make it. And I was wondering, what has been your experience since then? Has Europe made a difference for the Netherlands in the relationship with China?
We have certainly made progress. I have had very fruitful conversations both at the EU Foreign Affairs Council about our policy towards China, and also with my colleagues in a number of like-minded countries. For instance, the Chinese Minister Wang Yi visited the Netherlands and a number of other European countries last year. And the fact that the Netherlands is amongst one of the countries visited shows that being a strong country, economically strong, and added to that with a very strong academia, makes us an interesting partner for China, which allows us to speak clearly not only on our economic interests, but also about our concerns in the field of human rights and democracy. And around such a visit, I have close contact with the other colleagues that are being visited, and we also discuss in the European Foreign Affairs Council what our common policy towards China has to be. So yes, to sum up, there is progress.
And how do you look at the role of the member states here and the diversity among member states in the European relationship with China? You mentioned QMV as an important instrument. Do you also see that as an instrument to overcome diversity in the relationship with China? Or do you rely more on coordination or like-minded groups like you mentioned?
Yeah. The Netherlands is in favor of QMV, especially in the fields of applying sanctions. It has always been a sensitive subject within the European Union, and quite bluntly, it will take a long time before each and every country will agree. Maybe we could find each other halfway in accepting something like the possibility to abstain during constructive abstention, we would call that.
Yeah.
We saw, of course, how long it took to agree on sanctions towards Belarus, and at least that created more urgency for this discussion about making the step towards QMV. We can't afford it. Other examples of this kind of haggling over sanctions.
Yeah. Thank you. Adriaan, do you want to come in here? Adriaan, are you there? Yeah, great. You're still muted.
I thought that was all going to happen automatically in these digital ages. We've got 190 participants, and the Q&A is already piling up very, very fast. Some questions are about China. Indeed, for example, the acquisitions of China that are happening in the EU. What can the EU do more, or need the EU to do more in order to get a better grip on the acquisitions of China in the EU?
I think the first steps have been set at the EU level to make it possible for member states to indeed take action, and the Dutch government will shortly be presenting a law that would allow us to take action whenever a takeover might threaten our economic resilience. This for me wouldn't mean it should be impossible for a Chinese or non-European country to take over European or Dutch company. The Netherlands also has an interest in a world where it is possible to do cross-border takeovers, but that we would have a possibility that we don't have yet, to look at the security risks involved, and not only narrowly defined as national security interests, but also the risk of key technology being exported or hampered in its effectiveness. And I'm afraid we learned our lesson there in the last couple of years, and that for that we will need this both national and European regulation.
A question related to your plea for a stronger Europe and a stronger member states is coming from Norman Schulz, and it's about subsidiarity. How do you see subsidiarity, and does subsidiarity involve, in the specific cases you mentioned, also a further transition of national competences at the EU level?
One of the focus points in my speech, and of course this wasn't the first time that I mentioned, is that the EU can only be strong if the individual member states are strong. I was member of government, member of the coalition at the start of the financial crisis, 2010. And in the Netherlands, we took great pain to implement the necessary reforms. And that put us in a position where we are not dependent on EU money, but of course, we are still very much part of Europe and have an interest in a well-functioning market and legal systems. But I use this example to show that apart from the legal debate about subsidiarity, it really is in the interest of each and every EU member state to do its homework, whether or not the EU requires you to do the homework. It makes your country stronger, and in the end, it makes all of us stronger. And that's the reason why, however much I'm a believer in strong European coordination, I'm also a believer in a very strong national responsibility to keep your own house in order.
If you tell this to other member states, this is a rather Dutch narrative, and we're well known for it. If you tell this in other member states, how, in all the capitals, what are the responses that you get with this emphasis?
It is a story that a number of countries both understand and feel as their own. And there are, of course, there you are perfectly right, countries that don't feel it as their own story, but still they understand. I always use the example of the pension age, where I explained that amongst the measures that our government took, and I was at the negotiating table myself at that moment, was raising pension age, which means that each and every Dutchman, whether he is a professor or a bus driver, will have to work till 67, 68. And I explain, how can I ever explain to the professor or the bus driver that he or she will have to work till 67 or 68 and transfer his or her taxpayers' money to a country that didn't take these kind of measures? Every politician, regardless of which country he or she is coming from, understands his reasoning. Another example I always use is that one of the benefits of our common European market is that a company, whether it is a small startup or a large corporate, that has to decide about where to create a factory or a new business, is free to choose. And whether the choice will be on the Netherlands or France or Italy or Spain or Latvia depends on the local decisions that have been made on different fields like quality of education, quality of infrastructure, how accessible is the judiciary and the legal system. So it is good that there is the recovery fund now, but still, to make it effective, each and every country has to make sure that the economic environment, the business environment within the country is such that these entrepreneurs, whether they are big or small, have an incentive to choose your country to do their investments.
a related question here about the strength of the member states that comes from the Q&A is about Poland and Hungary. What to expect in the future about this relation? The toolbox so far has not really worked really effectively. Can we expect a change in this respect in the near future?
Well, literally, as we speak here online, there is, of course, the trilogue, as it is called, between European Parliament, European Commission, and Germany as the presiding member state, specifically about the connection between the rule of law and money from both the Recovery Fund and the MFF. And as you know, the Netherlands, together with a lot of other countries, has always stood firm for this rule of law conditionality. The European Parliament is siding with us, and that's why they are negotiating now. And of course, I don't know the outcome yet, but the fact that these negotiations are taking place shows that this certainly is not a subject where it is just the Netherlands that's struggling for a good cause, but that European Parliament, many member states, many people within, you mentioned Poland and Hungary, realize themselves very well how fundamental independent judiciary, the rule of law, is for our common European well-being.
A related question from Jan Willem van der Vossen is about democracy. Could a stronger role for the European Parliament contribute to better supervision of economic reforms, of rule of law reforms, also of the behavior of the Commission, that the Commission is doing the right thing? So the question is, how do you see the development of the European Parliament and democratic supervision when it comes to these changes that have to be made?
Of course, the European Parliament is taking its role, as illustrated by the negotiations about rule of law conditionality we just spoke about. The legal possibilities for the European Parliament have been greatly enhanced within the Lisbon Treaty. So I see a powerful European Parliament. I think the main challenge for the European Parliament is to stay well connected with the national audiences. In Netherlands and a lot of countries, you see a rather low turnout at the European elections, combined with lukewarm interest in what's taking place in Brussels or Strasbourg. So I think the main challenge for the European Parliament is to stay connected, or rather get more connected with national audiences and show how decisions being made in Brussels or Strasbourg influence daily lives of voters.
And also questions about the instruments that the EU has when it comes to stronger member states. We've relied heavily on rules and supervision. Yet we're still in the situation where we have these difficulties. Should we explore new avenues, for example, which has now been opened with the Recovery Fund? Or should we look back at the rule system and try to improve it? How about the development of the toolbox to stimulate convergence of the member states? That's the question you raised. How do we do it, and what experience do we have?
Yes, it's a good question. I think we've become sadder and wiser with regard to rules. At the start of the Euro and agreement on the Stability of Growth Pact, there were high hopes that economic convergence would follow from each and every country abiding to the rules. And unfortunately, this hasn't happened to the extent we hoped then. even creating severe problems during economic recessions. Therefore, indeed, the way chosen with a recovery fund is a new one, because it offers a bonus, not only a stick, but also a carrot. If you implement economic reforms that the European Commission deems useful in its yearly assessment, that will entitle a country to the grants that form part of the recovery fund. So indeed, it is a new instrument, and I'm actually optimistic about the impetus this should give to economic reforms.
Okay, thank you. I'm checking with Monika. Monika, have you been able to look at the Q&A? We have 192 participants. Monika?
I think it is the advantage of Zoom that we can involve so many people. And I'm also looking at the clock, Adriaan. So I really want to thank all the participants for interacting with the Minister, and thank you also, Minister, for answering all these questions. It has been, I think, a fruitful first session, and your focus on the resilience of member states, I'm sure, will return in the sessions to come and will be further problematized in tomorrow's session on migration. I'm sure that the strengthening of the capacity of asylum systems in member states will be an issue, their implementation of the existing rules, but it will also be linked, I expect, to the legitimacy of these rules and the possibility to change them, to make them future-proof. And I'm sure that Adriaan Schout himself will return to the theme of the resilient member states when he will chair the second session of today, this afternoon at 2:30. On the precarious situation of the euro, with Eric Jones, Sylvia Merler, and Michael Hydra from the Ministry of Finance. So thank you, Minister. Thank you, Adriaan. Thank you to the almost 200 participants for this opening session. And I hope to see you all back at 2:30. And before I forget it, the program is on the website, the Europe à la carte menu of 8 webinars. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, my thanks to all the participants, and especially to Monika and Adriaan.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.